Okay, so we're going to start today. We're going to start chapter 10, okay? And chapter 10, as you can see, is about statistics. So statistics, it's really just gathering, analyzing, and making predictions from numerical information. That's obtained in an experiment. Generally, what you're doing is you're trying to analyze and study a population, or a group of people, or even objects. You know, that's something you generally study. And using statistics, you actually get numerical data and make predictions and patterns, that kind of thing, about that group. The definition here, let me just say this. I actually got this from the textbook that the school uses for Math 101, because I thought that definition was a little bit better. I thought the definition in the book we're using is a little confusing. So, but that's really what statistics is, and we're going to see an introduction to that in 10 and I think 11 and 12 also, if I remember correctly. Okay. So basically in chapter 10, we're going to see things like we're going to learn new vocabulary regarding statistics, you know, like what populations and what samples are. We're going to see ways of actually forming these samples. That's what sampling methods are. Things can go wrong, though, when you're making a sample. Namely, what can happen is you could have what's called bias. And basically, you'll see though that generally with the population, you're not able to work with everybody or everything in that population because, you know, it's too costly. There's too many people, for instance. So what you want to do is form a sample. And when you're making a sample, it may not be representative of the population. You know, things like that could go wrong. Then we'll see the difference between experiments and observational studies. You know, we'll see that. Experiments is actually what we'll get to that. And then we'll see a little bit about presenting data. So we'll see all this stuff, not today, but we'll see this stuff, all this in chapter 10 now. So again, it's an introduction to statistics. So here's just some terminology. Again, in statistics, what we're studying are large groups of objects or people. And what we like to do is to collect and analyze data about it. So for instance, the population may be, the population is in the study, it's the group that you're studying. It's the group of people or objects that you're collecting data about, and you want to study them. So it's the entire group of objects or individuals of interest in a statistical study. So it's the entire group of people you want to study, though. Okay. You know, for instance, I put an example here. For instance, let's say we want to know, for whatever reason, how many hours of reading per week a typical college student does. Okay? So, or in this case, a typical SUNY Oneonta college student does. Okay? You know, of course, we have to be specific and specify the population. Can't just say college students because there's so many different college students out there. So we're going to focus on SUNY Oneonta students, okay? So this would be our population. That's the group, the entire group, in this case of people, that we would like to study, okay? And generally with a population, you know, there's just too many people or objects to study at once. I don't remember how many students are enrolled here at SUNY Oneonta, how many there are, but there's got to be at least 1,000, a couple thousand, I would say. But again, there's way too many to study all at once. Okay? And that's where the idea of sample comes into play. Okay? Generally, again, the idea with a sample is, usually we'll see this on the next slide, but a sample is really a smaller subset of that population. So you're not going to study all of SUNY Oneonta students at once. Instead, you're going to look at a sub-collection of them, and that would be our sample. But again, we have to be very careful though. So we have to be specific. We have to be very careful when we make that sample. And with the population, we have to be specific as well. You know, because depending on which college students we ask, we might get very different answers here. How many hours a week? How many hours of reading a week per week a typical college student does? So we do have to be very specific. You know, for instance, if we were only to ask students that are majoring in majors like the humanities, you know, like philosophy, English, history, those kinds of things, you know, you're going to get very different answers than someone who majors in physics, chemistry, math. You know, I don't know which major has more reading, okay, but you will get very different answers. So we have to be very specific about what population we're studying. I mean, even if you change the college, you might get very different answers. You know, if you compare students at SUNY Oneonta to SUNY Binghamton or University at Albany, you know, you're going to get very different answers. Those schools, you know, they're like different environments. I know Binghamton, for instance, is a R1 school, as they call it. So I would guess students there do a lot more reading than at SUNY Oneonta. I could be wrong about that. Okay. But you do have to be very specific about the population you're dealing with. Okay. And this will tie in also with the sample idea. Again, you're going to want, you're going to want your sample to be representative of the entire population. So similar to this, if you're going to get a sample of SUNY Oneonta students, you don't want your sample to just contain physics majors, right? Because not every student at SUNY Oneonta is a physics major. You're not going to want all the students to be, you know, majoring in philosophy, because not every student is a philosophy major. You know, you're not going to want the whole sample to be just seniors either, right? Not every student here is just a senior. You want it to be representative of the entire population. We'll get to that shortly, actually, but this is just some more terminology. So a parameter, for instance, that's a value that's calculated from everybody in the population or using all the data from a population. Like the 2020 census, right? That was a parameter for, I guess, New York State, I think it was. They were trying to get the entire population, a survey of them. I think it was for all of New York State. They were trying to learn something about everyone, an entire population. That's what a census is. So I guess going back to the SUNY Oneonta idea, if you wanted to ask every student here at SUNY Oneonta, I mean, even with technology, it could be very costly, but you would use something like a census. You know, you could ask them, for instance, how many hours a week do you do, or do they read on average, something like that. But again, it would be time consuming. You know, you would have to somehow send an email to, or a letter or whatever to every student here at SUNY Oneonta, right? And then you would have to collect all the data, somehow organize it. You know, it's very time consuming. So going back to the idea of sample, I know I mentioned it already. Generally with the population, there's way too many to deal with at once. So what people do when they're studying a population, what they'll do is they'll study instead a sample, which again is a smaller subset of the entire population, but you want it to be so that it's representative of the entire population. You know, this is like what I was saying before over here. If you want to study